In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my oil wash that I've been using. A lot of people have been asking questions, so I'll be going through the recipe that I use for it, but also I'll be using it on some Army Painter Speedpaints just to see what the reactivation issue is like and go through whether or not it does have a big effect on that and whether or not you should be varnishing beforehand. So to kick things off, I tend to use an oil wash with pretty much everything that I do at the moment. It's just a really nice and easy way to be able to get some good shadows in there, to be able to kind of mix up some of those colors and just add a little bit of vibrancy in different places. They're really easy to use and you're in pretty much full control over how much color goes on there, because you can go back in with a Q-tip and wipe it off all the sort of like high areas that you don't want some of that shadow on or any of that oil wash left over. Historically, I've been using these on contrast paints and Army Painter Speedpaints and I've not had any issues yet. However, there are some niggling issues where I have noticed a little bit of staining when it comes to the Army Painter Speedpaints. Not necessarily any reactivation issues, but definitely a little bit of staining, which dulls the whole thing down. Now, it's not been too much of an issue with some of the models I have been painting because they've been quite dark and dirty anyway, so it's not made a big difference. But if I want to get some more vibrancy, I just want to experiment with this and figured I'd take you guys along for the ride. One of the big things that I want to try out, because I don't normally do any varnishing after I've done my normal painting and then go to the oil washes, I'm going to do half of these without the varnish and half of them with the varnish and just see what ends up happening and which ones look best. So the models I'm going to be using for this video are by Dragon's Forge Miniatures. Now, I really like their models. There's some fantastic sculpts, and I just want to say, first off, thank you very much to Dragon's Forge Miniatures for sending these over to me free of charge to try out, and I'm going to be having a lot of fun with these. The great thing about these is they're really well detailed, and they come in either 32mm scale or 28mm scale. So if you're doing some wargaming or tabletop gaming in that respect, then you can go for your 32. If you're going for something like D&D scale, it's nice to have that 28mm because they're just a little bit smaller. They also come with their own little custom bases, and one of the things I love about these miniatures is their bases are really, really detailed, and even at the smaller scale, they look incredibly detailed, and I'm going to have a lot of fun with these. So first up, I've hit them with a Zenithal Prime, so I've hit them with the black with my airbrush, and then gone over with a white ink over top just to really get some of those shadows. Again, it helps to really capture some of those details, make it pop, gives me a little bit more to work with, and I really like doing this effect, especially when I'm working with things like contrast paints or Army Painter Speedpaints. At this stage, I figured it's about time that I just kind of grab some random colors, and my thoughts are with this, instead of kind of really planning it all out, because they're all so varied and different in terms of their items of clothing and their armor and the weapons, and even, I guess, skin tones, because you've got some like more demon type things in there. You've got your orcs, you've got your elves, you've got your humans, a whole mix of races. I figured I'm just literally going to grab some colors, and each color I get, I'll try and put maybe one of that color onto each and every single one of the models and just go around it that way and just see what the end result is. Once I've done that, I will mix up a few oil washes and we'll see what those effects are on the varnished and non-varnished ones. So let's see how that turns out. So skipping forward to the future, I'm a little bit hairy and it's really hot in the UK at the moment, which is a big surprise. So I basically went around and I painted all these up with the speed painters, just picking randomly from different colors, trying to throw that color onto whichever one I could. And I got some good results straight away. These thieves paint up really nicely. There's a good amount of detail despite them being a smaller model, obviously coming off in the smaller scale that I chose. But yeah, I really like them, and the colors were already starting to pop. It was at this stage I got a little bit nervous because I am used to using an oil wash, but I hadn't used like varnishes and everything else at this stage of the painting process, so I wasn't too sure what to expect. After they were all painted, I left them for about 12 hours just because I ran out of time for that day, and I figured the next morning I could get them all varnished and then leave them to set until night time. The two varnishes I chose to use, I'll have them up on screen so you can see those, and they'll be linked down in the description as well. I went with a matte varnish and a gloss varnish, obviously like I said at the beginning, and it was kind of surprising. The gloss varnish caused no reactivation issues at all. It was really easy to apply, had no issues, just made them look very shiny, of course. The matte varnish, however, definitely started to reactivate the Army Painter Speedpaint. So like I said, I left them for about 12 hours. If you are varnishing with a brush, then just go very lightly with these because it does definitely cause a reactivation there. It wasn't major and it didn't ruin the paint job or anything like that, but if you've done some really fine detail work and you're really precious about what you'd already done, it could be a bit of a deal breaker. So maybe leave them for a little bit longer or potentially airbrush it on there as well, obviously if that's what you're into. So the next stage, once all of that dried and the varnish had set, was to make an oil wash. Now I already had an oil wash that was pre-made, it's my black oil wash, but I wanted to show you how to make it because a few people have asked. Now I'm not going to go into sort of like the quantities of what you're going to need for this just because it varies depending on the effect you want. You can go for a really thin oil wash and it becomes more like a panel liner type thing and it just gets into the details. You can go for a relatively thick oil wash, you know, like I did with my zombies from Highland Miniatures quite a while ago, and that gives a really rough and dirty look and you can rub it all off afterwards, and depending on what type of model you're going for will obviously depend on the consistency of the oil wash you want to go with. So for my oil washes, I use a Winsor & Newton oil. I really like these. They're really high in pigmentation apparently. They're very reliable. I've had no problems. Now, at first glance, it looks like it'd be really expensive because you get this massive tube of it, and it costs a decent amount, but when you think about it, it's literally going to last me forever. The only thing I need to replace is my white spirits, and basically you grab some of that with a pipette and start mixing. Now, before you do this process, make sure you're in a decently ventilated area. It will be giving off some fumes and you don't want to be breathing that stuff in too much or be just kind of like compacted into a small space with it. So safety first, make sure you're ventilated. Now, don't do what I did at this stage. I used a really bad palette. Like I said, I'd already got some mixed up, but I wanted to capture it on camera for you. I couldn't find anything else readily available in the household. I didn't look particularly hard, but this palette was an absolute disaster. As you can see, things were sploshing all over the place and it was an absolute mess. But general rule of thumb is you want to use far less oil than you actually think you're going to use because you don't actually need too much. As you can see, I'm having to scoop out loads because I've used far too much to start off with. I always do it and I never learn from my own mistakes. Basically, pop your oil on the palette first, grab some of your white spirits using a pipette and slowly drip that in and mix it all in until you get the oil wash to the consistency that you like. And don't worry about it if it is a little bit too thick or you don't get the consistency that you want. The great thing about oils and oil washes is you can go back in, clean it up afterwards and rub it off with a sponge or like a makeup sponge. So get that oil wash to the consistency that you like and then start slapping it on your models. Now I love this stage because it really starts to soak in, gets into all the crevices and makes those details pop. Once that's been done, I left it for half an hour, came back in with my makeup sponges and started removing a lot of the oil washes where maybe it kind of pooled or left some tide marks or anything like that. Areas where I wanted the model to look a little bit lighter, I went back in there as well, rubbed it all off and then called it a day. Now you can start rubbing it off pretty much as and when you want to. If it's relatively wet, you need to just be careful because you will start to pull a lot of that oil wash out of the crevices, so you could lose some of that detail. And if you leave it too long, you'll need to get a little bit of white spirit onto your makeup sponge and then try using the reverse side of it just to rub some of it off. That reactivates that oil wash, but you just want to be careful because otherwise you'll end up taking too much off and potentially the paint underneath depending on what you've done. So general rule of thumb, I tend to leave mine for about half an hour or until they don't look too shiny and wet, and then I go back in there and give it a good clean up. So, once that was done, which ones look the best? Now, I have organised them all and I was smart enough to remember to actually mark the bases because otherwise I was probably not going to be able to tell. First up are just your standard ones and I really like these. Now, the thing with oil washes when I've used them on Army Painter Speedpaints or Citadel contrast paints is they kind of tint the whole model when you're not using a varnish. So you can still remove it off a lot of the areas and you can get quite a decent amount off. But it gets in there, it does what you'd expect from an oil wash, you can take it off some of those high areas, but it does slightly darken it all down, so depending on what type of colour you're using, you can tint the model as well, so just bear that in mind. With these, I think they all looked really good. I still kept a lot of the vibrancy of the colours that were underneath it. It didn't take away any of the paint at all, so again, it's the thing that I've found historically. I've had no issues using an oil wash freshly on these without varnish, and I think they will look pretty good. Moving across onto just the standard matte varnish, and to be honest, it did very little. I don't know what I was expecting. I kind of thought that maybe the oil wash would have come off a lot easier, but it makes sense. If it's a matte varnish, it's still going to have that sort of like texture to it, so it's still going to then soak into it. And to be honest, I think these ones that have the matte varnish look almost identical to the non-varnished ones. The benefit, however, is if you went back in there later on, so if you left it for a day, for example, and you saw some areas that were still a little bit dark, you've got some room to work with that because you can then reactivate the oil wash on there and not worry about kind of damaging that layer underneath. So you could use some white spirits, really get in there quite aggressively and not worry too much. Moving across onto the super shiny glossy varnish. And this was probably the most interesting one, and I guess it makes sense. It's giving all the models a really smooth surface. So that oil wash will then kind of flow off into all the crevices, and when you go back in there with your sponge, it becomes so much easier to remove it off some of those top areas. Now, these look, I think, probably the most vibrant out of the lot of them. There's not a massive amount between it, to be honest, but they still look a little bit more vibrant than some of the others. if we compare, for example, the green on these two orcs, yeah, it just looks a little bit more vibrant because I've been able to get some more of that oil wash off without kind of going back in there with white spirits. So that's a bonus. Now, what I would probably do, again, if I was doing, I don't know, maybe a single unit or a hero unit and I was going for this technique, I would potentially use the gloss varnish and then go back in there afterwards and use a matte varnish just to matte it all down once I got the oil washes where I wanted it to. So again, it's all down to your preference and what sort of style that you like. So I love using oil washes. It's my go-to thing for miniatures. I just think it's fantastic. It's great to work with. You've got a lot of flexibility. And now I suppose the question is, was it worth varnishing them before moving on to that oil wash stage? And personally, I don't think it is. I guess again, it comes down to what type of units you're doing. If you're doing a regiment, if you're doing a lot of units, then absolutely not. It's just adding another layer where you've got to get your brush out or your airbrush or whatever and varnish them all up and then apply your oil wash. If you choose to go with the gloss varnish, which is probably going to give you the most control, then you've also then got to go back in with a matte varnish afterwards and just dull it all down. So no, if you're doing a regiment or a lot of units, I'd say there's no point in using a varnish. I've had no ill effects using contrast paint or speed paint and then throwing the oil wash on pretty much straight away afterwards. The minimum time I've ever left it is about an hour and I've had no issues with reactivation, so that's always been good for me. So honestly, no, I don't think the varnish is worth it when you're doing a lot of units. However, if you are doing something like a heroic unit or a single unit or something that you really want to maintain the vibrancy and that first base coat, then maybe a varnish is going to be worthwhile going for. So I hope that video's helped. It kind of told me what I already expected, that the gloss varnish was going to be the one to go for if you're going for the kind of technique. Matte varnish is decent enough, and like I said, it gives you a little bit more control of that cleanup, but honestly, I think these look fantastic without having a layer of varnish on there, so you can't go too far wrong. And once again, thank you very much, Dragon's Forge Miniatures, for sending this set over to me. It's been great fun printing these off. They're available in 28mm or 32mm, and there's some really fantastic poses as well, so can't go too far wrong with that one. Let me know how you've been using oil washes and any tips and techniques you've got for everybody else in the audience. In the meantime, stay safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.